Now this is the most specific, detailed, single-focused webinar that we've given, and we've been very encouraged by the number of participants that we've had attending, even when we get into these kind of unique areas. The Spyder Cube is in some ways my baby. I have been involved with its development and usage ever since we originally started producing the product, and I've worked in the last several months with David Saffir quite closely in determining some new uses for the Spyder Cube that aren't just adjusting your raw settings with it after the fact, but rather getting things right in the camera and even using it for setup, for studio lighting. So I hope that David will have time in his hour, if I don't take too much of it up here, to cover a number of those facets of Spyder Cube use. I'd also like to say that I'm happy to see some names I recognize of attending this webinar, photographers I've worked with, companies that I love to see represented. I won't name any names other than Apple, but it's nice to see you all here. And what we will do is, once the webinar is in progress, we'll do 2 or 3 polls so we get some information from you. And then at the end, we will have a raffle among the participants who've stuck it out for a Spyder 4 Pro, and then we'll also have a discount option for other attendees, so be sure to stick around for those things at the end. Now I'm going to hand you over to David Saffir, and you're going to get to see a few of his lovely photos from his latest safari in Washington State, as well as hear about the Spyder Cube. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Hello, everybody. Again, this is David Saffir. I'm a photographer and printmaker. I live in Southern California. And as David mentioned, we've been working for several months now on some different ways, some advanced ways to use the Spyder Cube in managing your image capture and also in post-production. And I think that you're going to find that a little bit of it is out of the box, probably no pun intended, and that you'll find that a very simple, small tool is going to be extremely useful to you going forward in terms of managing your exposure, dynamic range, color, and some other issues. So
David, let me break in here one more time. The only thing I didn't mention is that I'm going to be answering questions live the entire hour. So if you people can configure your window so that you can see the questions and answers, and then feel free to ask me, particularly Spyder Cube related questions. I'm game for anything, but those are what we'll focus on. Then I will type away on that while David is talking. So I'm sorry to interrupt you. I'll go back into listen mode here.
Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. There's a number of data color capture products. We've done a webinar previously on these. The Spyder Lens Cal, for example, can be used for calibrating your lenses with appropriate cameras. And the Spyder Checker, of course, is used as a color reference chart, as a camera profiling device, and some other things as well. So we have a family of products here that are all used to help you manage capture and also, in some cases, post-production. Now, the focus for today is the Spyder Cube. It's a multi-purpose device, and interestingly, this is probably close to life size. It's multi-purpose, it's versatile and durable. It's pretty much indestructible, and it's made of an advanced polymer. So, for example, if you scratch it, it doesn't affect its ability to help you in your work in any way. The bottom has a threaded mount, so you can mount it on a tripod or appropriate light stand. And you can use it in exposure management. You can use it to set in-camera white balance. You can use it in post to help you with your color or gray balance. And it's also quite useful in managing dynamic range, and that's the range of tones from the brightest tones in your image to the darkest tones in your image as you wish to see them. And that's important. It's related, we're talking in terms of related to the zone system, and I'm not going to delve into that down to 20,000 feet and bore you to death. I'm going to talk about it a little bit as a way of illustrating how the Spyder Cube can help you in your work. It's useful for handheld shooting, studio work, tethered shooting in particular, and in post-production. And it's more than a gray card. Much more than a gray card. So here's an illustration of a setup that we had put together for photographing some artwork. And we have a gray card in it. And the gray cards work fine in terms of managing color, but you've got some issues with this. It's a single plane, and some of these will become a little bit more clear as we go forward of why I'm talking about these. A single plane means that you can't really use it to measure light coming from different directions. It's unidirectional. It's limited to helping you with mid-range exposure and your color or gray balance. It can't help you address all of your dynamic range issues. It can't help you set your black point or your white point. It can't even tell you in camera whether your LCD is telling you the truth. You can't even use a black-white gray card for the same kind of purpose that you can use the SpyderCUBE. So they have some pretty significant limitations. You're in a position where it'll do part of the job, but it doesn't necessarily do the whole job. It's certainly better than nothing, and I would encourage you, if you're using one, to at least to continue to use it until you decide whether or not you feel a SpyderCUBE is for you. But in any event, if you look at this chart on the bottom of your screen, the SpyderCUBE is really the tool that you want if you want to manage that range of endpoint, the range of intermediate tones and the white and black endpoints. Now we're going to start with a poll, real quick one. We want to know if you're using a gray balance tool, whether it's a card or a lens overlay, and just go ahead and answer that, and we'll pause while we go forward. Okay, so let's have a look at the results. 35% of the attendees are using a card. 6% are using a lens overlay. Excuse me, a lens overlay. 23% are using a color target, and 24% are using a SpyderCUBE, and 13% are using none of the above. That's an interesting distribution. That's a very interesting distribution. In particular, I'm impressed by the high level of usage of the color target in the SpyderCUBE. Very interesting. Thank you. Okay, let me get back over to my screen. Now, the zone system was developed by Ansel Adams, and some people don't know this, but Fred Archer played a part. And it was intended to provide a benchmark for optimal image exposure, of course, in the days of film. And it started with black and white sheet film. It was applicable to other films. And, of course, as time went on, people found that it was applicable for digital. And you can see that there's these panels, and they're numbered from 0 to 10. And they're really intended to, as a benchmark, to help you understand how you can render light subjects as light and dark subjects as dark according to your visualization or your intent. And that's an important point. It's not something that's supposed to lock you in and say, well, you have to be in zone 9 or you have to be in zone 3. It's a benchmark. And when you take a shot sometimes, and I think we all know this, that the camera isn't always capable of capturing that full range of tones. Sometimes you have to sacrifice the shadows for the highlights and vice versa. But it has to be by intent. I think that you don't want to be shooting, if you pardon me, blindly and hoping for the best. What you want to do is be aware of where your endpoints are and how choosing an endpoint is going to affect your midtones. Now, zone 1 is near black with slight tonality and no texture. And zone 9 with slight tonality, no texture, sort of like bright snow. And the key to success here, and this is part of getting it right in the camera, is to control the endpoints in the mid-range. So again, it's a benchmark. The zone system, it's treated as something that's very esoteric and mysterious and only for extremely advanced photographers, and I think that's a bunch of baloney. I think that it's very clear that it's intended simply as a reference for most people in most situations, and that you can use this going forward to gauge how you're doing in terms of getting what you want in your work and getting it right in the camera. Now, most of us have cameras that allow us to set a custom white balance. Hang on one second, I'm going to take a sip of water. Thank you. And put the SpyderCUBE in the scene and fill the frame as much as you can. And then every camera is slightly different. You're going to fill the frame with the SpyderCUBE and you're going to set the white balance, the custom white balance. And what this does is it maximizes the usefulness of the camera's LCD display and its JPEG review. And here's why. I wouldn't say it's deceptive practice, but what the camera manufacturers don't tell you is that the LCD is showing you a semi-processed JPEG, not your RAW file. And that's an important thing to know. The LCD at best is in my opinion, a relatively weak representation of what your image really is going to deliver for you. And setting a custom white balance in a given lighting condition will improve the appearance of that in the sense that color and density will improve. And if you have them enabled, the white clipping view, the blinkies, those highlights that flash on and off, black to white, will be more accurate. Now, if you have a proper exposure, here's where the different parts of the SpyderCUBE sort of the use of them becomes a little clearer. The chrome ball at the top will almost always have a bright highlight on it, in a well-lit, particularly in a well-lit scene, and that should almost always be blinking. That will show you where your specular highlights are. If, however, whichever of the white panels, and remember the SpyderCUBE is a multi-dimensional surface, so it can show you the intensity of light coming from different directions, but on the brightest side, if the white area is blinking, it's very likely that you're overexposed. That's inside the blue circle on the screen in front of you. And that's definitely a warning sign that either you need to understand that you're going to lose some detail in the highlights in this photograph, or you're going to have to adjust your exposure and on the high side and bring it down. Now, those are decisions that you have to make on the spot. One of the things that there's a real advantage in using the SpyderCUBE for this is if you're shooting tethered rather than in the field, because now you have a hopefully calibrated computer screen, and you will be able to see. You could even go ahead and change the exposure settings and take a test shot and see how your highlights are doing in the test shot with the adjustment and get a much more accurate view of what may be your end result. But I digress for a second. There's also, I'm going to flip back to the previous slide. If you look at this picture, there is a black trap or a black circle in the center of the frame, and that should, with proper exposure, appear to be darker than the black frame around it. And that gives you an indication of the bottom end of your zones, whether or not you are underexposed or not. Now, again, it's a decision, it's a creative decision or an artistic decision or a technical decision. It's not locked in. You can increase exposure. Now, what happens if you feel like you have to give up one for the other? Well, that's what's going to happen. If you look at the picture in the camera LCD at the bottom, this is a picture of an old truck in a field in an area called the Palouse in Washington State. And this picture was taken in early morning direct sun. And I had to make a couple of decisions. If I made the photograph, the exposure, bright enough to see into the shadows on the side of the car. The headlight, which was reflecting light back into the camera, was much too bright. And so I throttled down the exposure and gave up the shadows in the background. And the SpyderCUBE quite clearly showed me where that decision point was. So it's part of your creative process or your production process. Getting it right in the camera is much easier with the SpyderCUBE. Now at this point you would set your manual exposure, use that to fine-tune if you wish, and go ahead and shoot. Now you can also use the SpyderCUBE in studio and on location, and use it as the first in a series of images with the same lighting condition. And this crazy eye test, I apologize, but it was the only way I could figure out to show you the purpose or the names of all these different surfaces. If you look on the right side, you can see it says the primary light source, gray, primary light source, card white. You can see the nomenclature, the black trap, absolute black. That's black with absolutely no detail, no texture. The black face is what we sometimes call card black, which may have a little bit of texture in it. And you have secondary surfaces. This is particularly useful if you're shooting with multiple lighting sources, even if they're the same color temperature, because you can choose whether to use those surfaces on the key light side or the secondary light side, as you can use those references on the key light side or the secondary light side. So if you take a photograph that includes the cube, it'll capture important information about your shooting conditions that you can use in making raw adjustments. Now, of course, you can always have previously set the automatic white balance in the camera using the SpyderCUBE. But it provides multiple surface configurations. You can use it to measure your key light. You can use it to measure your secondary light or your fill lights. And I found it's particularly useful in making sure that when I add a second, third, or fourth light, that I'm not overpowering what's going on or even creating blown out highlights in some part of the setup that I didn't intend to have. Now, this is like a nightmare situation, if you know what I mean, particularly in public buildings, but also more and more as one moves around. You can find situations where they have the environmental friendly light bulbs, they have fluorescent light bulbs, they have incandescent light bulbs, and they have window light all in the same room. And it gets to the point where if you don't have a cube, or even a gray card for that matter, you're in a situation where it's going to be very, very difficult to control the color in post-production. So this shot is looking pretty bad, and it's got at least 3 or 4 different types of light in use in the room. Now, we're starting off with Lightroom 4, and I'm going to push my cursor onto the screen and just point out that the blue arrows are pointing simply to the different light sources. And on the Lightroom control panels, you see here a red rectangle that shows you the histogram. Pretty mixed results in the histogram. And we have a white balance, or sometimes called a gray balance, eyedropper. Now, if one would zoom in on this picture, one would pick, and you can see that one side is slightly brighter than the other. One would pick a side of the SpyderCUBE and click on it. Now, once you've done that, I'm going to flip forward and then back again. You would get a result that's something like this, but there's a couple of things in between. Particularly with the new controls in Lightroom 4, once you had set the gray balance, you can go forward and adjust exposure and highlight shadows, whites, and blacks. Now, David might disagree with me on this, but there are times where I will set the gray balance and make some of these adjustments and then go back and try the gray balance again, just to see if I get a better result or a worse result. You can always undo it. But I sometimes find that if I make strong enough adjustments that a second gray balance is helpful. Sometimes it's not. It depends on the situation. Now, there's a couple of tools in Lightroom that I think you should know about. Very, very helpful. If you hold down the Alt in Windows or the Option key on the Mac and you move these sliders, you're going to get what's called clipping warnings. And basically what it does is as you move, for example, the highlight slider to the right in this case, the brightest parts of the photograph, the parts that are going to lose detail and go off into the ozone, that was an intended pun, they're going to lose detail, are going to start showing up. And the first thing they're going to do is show you the color channel that's blowing out first. So over here on the right, the green color channel is blowing out first. But these lamps were pretty much overexposed to begin with. So as soon as I pushed down the Option key, they showed up as being problem areas. Now, you can also watch the histogram. And in this case, you would watch the right side and watch for the spike, and that spike represents those two lamps. And the more you push the highlight slider to the right, I'm sorry, the exposure slider to the right, the more you're going to see this histogram move to the right as well. Now, you can also turn on the clipping warnings for both highlights and shadows with these little triangles that are in the upper right-hand corners of the histogram panel. So there's a couple of ways that you can address this. I strongly urge you, if you haven't done this before, to try it. I think it will teach you a lot about what's possible in post-production and what your end result is going to look like. You really don't want to go too far down the path of editing without having some kind of heads up about what's the cumulative effect of the changes that you're making. It's kind of a pain in the neck to have to undo 20 history steps and redo them because you find that the image has got so much stack up in editing that it's not usable anymore. It happens to people, particularly late at night, as we all know. So looking at the end result, I think it's very pleasing. You can see the histogram is much better balanced, et cetera, but most importantly, the SpyderCUBE helped us balance the color in this image quite nicely. Now, here we are in Camera Raw 7.0. This really isn't that much different than, say, earlier versions of Camera Raw, obviously used with Photoshop, except that a lot of these sliders now start at 0 position in the middle, rather than all the way at the left. So it's a little more congruent with Lightroom. It's also easier to use because obviously you can get into the negatives or positives instead of starting from a 0 point. The same tools exist here in terms of the triangles in the midst of the histogram, and the same thing applies in terms of, say, moving the exposure slider. If you hold down the Alt key in Windows or the Option key on the Mac, you will see the clipping warnings come up on your screen. Now, the dropper is in a different place, of course. It's on the upper left, and if you click once on it and bring it down, sometimes it's helpful to zoom in and click on that, the most brightly lit gray surface. Again, you will get your color correction that you need. And there we go. Now, it's not illustrated here, but there's a couple of things I'm going to point out. Is that you can place color samplers using this tool right here anywhere you want in the image. And when you place them, they're going to show up right here, and they're going to give you the RGB numbers. So one way to keep track of the color balance in various parts of your image, for example, on the pillow, would be to place a color sampler right there, and then you could keep an eye on it and have a look at, first of all, how bright it was. Is it 255, 255, 255? That's going to be pure white. Or is it still showing you a bit of mixed color for some reason? Usually that won't be the case, but you can see if colors are accurate as well as pleasing to the eye on your calibrated screen. Okay, now, and take a quick look at this photograph. It's not the greatest picture in the world, but I think you can see that as compared to this image, just take a look at the walls, for example, okay, as a point of detail, and then we come back forward. You can see the textures in the walls much more clearly. So there's a lot to be said for making this kind of precise correction, because it's going to, how do I put this? It's going to, when the colors are so far out of whack, it also tends to trash image quality overall. And so when you bring them back into range and you're really representing what the sensor should have seen, then you're in a much better position to get the most out of your photograph. Now, there's a couple of other things that you can do with the SpyderCUBE, and I think this is particularly useful. You know what? I omitted a point that I wanted to make, and I'm going to swing back here. Whether you're in Lightroom, I'm not going to get into the details because it's almost a discussion that one can spend a whole day on, but you can use in either Lightroom or in Camera Raw. There's a way to leapfrog these color corrections onto all the other images that you took in the same lighting conditions. In other words, you can synchronize them. So, for example, in Adobe Camera Raw, if I had opened several images at the same time, you would see thumbnails on the left. And there's a button that says Select All and Synchronize. So once you get that first image, like this one of the room, and let's say you have several other images of that room, you can simply click on Synchronize, and your color corrections and your adjustments to highlights and shadows and whites and blacks will all be, and several other things, will all be applied to those other images in that same batch. And it's a very powerful tool that you should think about investigating and take a look at. Now, let's say you have an image that has the SpyderCUBE in it, and you want to, and particularly in Photoshop, for example, it's quite easy to do a couple of things with, say, the curves adjustment panel. It's quite easy to set your white, black, and gray points using the SpyderCUBE, and I'm going to give you a little tip that you're going to find to be very useful, particularly if you're printing your work. Now, here's the thing, is that it's quite possible that in a photograph you would have white values in red, green, and blue, as you can see on the color picker here, of 255, 255, 255, which would be whitest white. But that's paper white. That's not going to give you anything on a printed page. So what you want to do is set back that white point a little bit, and you can actually do that as a custom setting. So what one does is double clicks, opens the curves adjustment panel. You double click on the white eyedropper, and the color picker will come up. And all you have to do is come down here to the RGB settings and type in 245 in each one of these. And that will set your white point, the brightest white point in your image, to what is, for most inkjet printers, the brightest tone that they can reproduce without going to paper white. And it's a very, very useful tool. So once you set that, you would click OK. You're going to, then you would go to the black eyedropper, and you would set that, instead of to 000 for absolute black, you would set it to about 6 in each one of those squares, and click OK. Now, I can't remember right at the moment whether at this point it asks you if you want these to be permanent settings or not. I think it's when you click OK on the curves palette that it does that. But in any event, you would use both of these eyedroppers to go over to the SpyderCUBE in your image. And the white eyedropper clicked on the brightest white face. The black eyedropper clicked on the black, or the black card face, not the black trap, but the black card face. And then last, the gray balance tool. And at that point, you're going to have your endpoints set properly so that you will have at least minimal detail in your brightest highlights, and minimal detail in your darkest shadows. Now, that's not going to help you if in some cases it won't help you if in some parts of your image, like we saw before with those table lamps, if they're so overexposed that there's no detail to begin with, setting them back to 245 in all three channels is not going to get you a whole lot of mileage. You might want to pick, that's not going to, I'll just step back and say, obviously you had to sacrifice the details in the lampshades to get the exposure correct in the rest of the room. And that applies to shadows. So you sometimes have to decide on the high end or the low end what your exposure has to be, or what you're going to give up when you're making your adjustments in post-production. Now, this is an example of Capture One Pro. It also works with Hasselblad's Focus. There are other programs where you can shoot tethered. And it's really the same kind of setup as Lightroom in a way, because in the color adjustment palette, which is outlined in orange here, I would go and grab the color adjustment, they call it the white balance eyedropper, and I would go to the Spyder Cube and click on that, and that would set the color balance for that frame. Now, just like with Lightroom, what I can do here is I can copy those settings and probably just about all the other settings on here and make all the adjustments to the first frame, copy them to a quote clipboard, and then apply them to all the other images, such as the one below, that are in the set. And again, you get an enormous benefit in terms of time savings and consistency from frame to frame. Now, if you change your lighting slightly, I wouldn't be too concerned about that. But if you do make a significant change in your lighting, you may want to put the Spyder Cube back in the scene and reshoot it and reset so that the photos that come after that would be consistent with those lighting conditions and not subordinated to ones that were used previously in the day. Now, the thing about the Spyder Cube is it's a known device, and being as durable as it is and made the way it is, it's pretty much indestructible. The colored surfaces, the white, the gray, and the black surfaces are made out of material that you could take a nail and drag it across it, and the color that comes through would still be consistent with the surface. It's multi-purpose. It's small and portable. It even comes in a little carrying bag, and I have one in just about every camera bag that I own. And it's mountable for controlled placement. In other words, you can place it on a light stand. You could use a quick clamp. It has a tethered string on the top. There's been times where I've given the Spyder Cube to somebody and said, could you just walk out in the middle of this scene and hold this thing up for me? And it works fine. It's really quite ideal for white-gray balance, and it's multi-sided for use in uneven or mixed lighting. And again, I can't overemphasize how important that is. A gray card can't do that for you. A gray card can only show you one dimension, one direction. It's useful but limited, and so the Spyder Cube, being multi-sided in uneven or mixed lighting, is really going to give you much more control. And the black, white, and gray values help you manage dynamic range, and again, I can't overemphasize that enough. Having a consistent reference that puts you in the zone, so to speak, that lets you go to a particular point in terms of the amount of light coming back to the camera, and making a rational decision about where you want your brightest point to be, how much detail you want to see on the high end, how much detail you want to see on the shadow side, is very, very important. And it's even more critical with digital, in my opinion, than it was in the days of shooting chromes. I've always thought digital is much more demanding than shooting chromes. I think digital is much more sensitive, particularly on the high end, to errors in capture. And so getting it right in the camera is even more important than it used to be. You know, it's kind of like that issue with, well, we'll fix it later in Photoshop, almost deserves a smack on the side of the head, because it's almost always a problem, excuse me, and very time consuming to try and fix these kinds of issues in post-production. It's also useful for in-camera white balance. My opinion of the presets on these cameras is that they're blunt instruments at best, that the daylight setting or the tungsten setting are useful, but there's really nothing better than a custom in-camera white balance. And yes, it's less convenient. And of course, if you have a SpyderCUBE in the picture, it will help you regulate both color balance and your endpoints. But that white balance also gives you, remember, a better preview, that you're looking at a processed JPEG, not a raw file. And so the closer you can get to reality, a true white balance in the camera, the better off you're going to be. JPEGs are really limited to begin with. They're not very flexible, and they tend to clip important things. And so the more you can support the camera in doing its job, the better off you're going to be. Now, let's see here. I'm not seeing questions on the screen for some reason today, so if there are some questions I can answer, I'd be glad to do that. We're finishing a little bit early. This is a fairly focused subject, and so I've run through pretty much the material that I wanted to cover. The article, I have an article that I've written in collaboration with David Tobie that's going to appear in the September issue of Phototechnique magazine. I suggest you take a look at that. It really covers the same material that we've covered here, with a little bit more detail about the zone system and a little bit more detail about post-production. And I think you'll find it to be quite useful. Now, I have a poll question for everybody. Take a look at this gray ramp on your screen and tell me if you can see all 11 steps. You answer all these that apply. Do all the steps look pure black, pure white, and pure gray? And do some of the steps have a color cast or color tint? They look a little red or green or magenta. So let's see what we get here. Okay, so we've got 88% can see all the steps, and 45% say they say that everything looks pure black, white, or gray, and 10% say that they see some kind of a color cast. Now, I would suggest that if any of you that have issues with not being able to see all the steps, or you're seeing a color cast, if you haven't recently calibrated your display, you should consider doing that. If you're not calibrating your display, I definitely recommend it. If after calibrating your display you can't see all these steps, you may be working with a monitor that's a little bit under the radar as far as giving you the maximum benefit when you're editing your photographs. So it's just something to think about, a little bit of an objective test for you. Okay, so I'm waiting for the, the winner of the Spyder 4 Pro is Nancy Fino. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, Nancy, and congratulations. We also have a promotional price on the Spyder, the Datacolor website. It's at SpyderDatacolor.com. 20% off starting on the 15th. That's today through the 22nd. The promo code is CUBE1. That's CUBE1 lowercase. By the way, I have a message here on my screen. Nancy, we will send you an email asking you for your mailing address. I'd like to offer my thanks to Datacolor for their kind sponsorship of this program. It's greatly appreciated. I enjoy the opportunity to meet with people and hopefully help to be better photographers. My name is David Saffir, and my blog address, my web address, and my email are all provided here. One thing I do for my students is that I'm perfectly happy to answer questions via email. I do get a lot of emails. If you find that you have sent me an email and you don't get an answer in 24 hours, please do send it again. It means that I missed it somehow, and that does happen occasionally, and it can't be helped. The volume is just too much sometimes. I'd also like to thank David Tobie. His blog, which is quite interesting, he's one of those technical wizards that you can't afford not to pay attention to, is cdtobie.wordpress.com, and his website is cdtobie.com. So I would like to thank everybody for attending. I appreciate your time and attention, and again, thanks to Datacolor for your sponsorship. David, do you have anything that you'd like to add?
No, I think you did a great job, David. You covered a lot of the issues, including a couple that I had told people might not be covered in the webinar, like the details of ACR setting locations, so I was very pleased to see them in there. I was also amused to see that one of your images kind of outlined the critical controls for ACR, and it looked very much like an illustration I built not long ago for showing where the ACR controls are for using the Cube the new way with the latest version of Photoshop 6 and ACR 7.1. I also did a similar illustration which covers Lightroom 4, and both of those are on the Spyder blog, and both of those I believe are up on my blog at the cdtobie.wordpress.com blog. So I believe that we've covered much of the same material in different ways between your webinar here and my articles and the other stuff that we've all put together to try to document this over the last month. So I appreciate your participation in all that, David.
Thank you.
Well, I think that covers our webinar for today. So keep in mind that you will be able to go to this webinar to review it or to show it to other people once you get the address emailed to you, which will happen within the next day or so, and that it will be available for, well, indefinitely on our website thereafter, and that you have an opportunity here to get this discount using the code that's listed here, but you should write it down from here because I don't guarantee that that will be included in the materials that goes up onto the website with the blog. So thank you all for attending, and we hope to see you next month or at some of our other events in the coming future.
I want to add one thing. David made a point about blog articles, and of course one thing that you can do to take advantage of the material that we both post online is to subscribe to those blogs, because we're constantly adding material. Although August I've been away quite a bit, we're constantly adding material to those, and if you subscribe to them, for example, via email, you can get updates automatically on color management, photography, and related issues. So take a look at that. All right, everybody, have a great week, and thank you very much for attending this webinar.